Hello, 8th grade. Ms. VT here again. This week we are working on my personal favorite, three-dimensional art.
Three-dimensional
artwork using clay. So, first thing we need to address, what is the difference between three-dimensional artwork and two-dimensional artwork? Three-dimensional artwork is artwork that is going to be sculptural, like a sculpture, or a cup, or anything that's not flat. Two-dimensional artwork is artwork that's flat, like a drawing. What does three-dimensional mean? Let's get into a little bit of math here. This is a coordinate plane. A coordinate plane has two axes. You have an x-axis and a y-axis. The x-axis goes across the plane, the y-axis goes up and down. That's two-dimensional artwork. Artwork on this book is flat. It goes up and down and it goes across, but nothing pops out of the artwork. In a sculpture, I have things that go across on the x-axis. I have things that go up and down on the y-axis, but I have a third dimension that's added.
The z-axis.
Three-dimensional artwork comes out, off the paper, into the third dimension. Three-dimensional, third axis. It's all coming together. And you asked when you'd need math in real life. You ever watched Stranger Things? You know how they have the upside down? That's a different axis. That's another dimension that we don't exist on. Same premise. Sculptural artwork exists on a dimension that paintings physically do not. There's lots of different supplies that you can use to make 3D artwork. And we're going to be looking at 3 different types of clay. Polymer clay, which is a professional art clay that dries into a hard plastic. Salt clay that can be made from things you can easily find in your kitchen. And Silky Dough. It's a type of Non-Newtonian clay. Science word there. While they all look like basic, squishy stuff, they work completely differently. Alright, here's what you're gonna need. Some measuring cups, measuring spoons, bowls, food dye, cheap hair conditioner, cornstarch, salt, and some flour. Alright, let's get started first with our recipe. This is a recipe I found online. It calls for 2 cups of flour, 1 cup of salt, and 1 cup of cold water. Now, I don't want to make a lot of clay, so I'm going to reduce this recipe. Instead of using 2 cups of flour, I'm only going to use half a cup. However, the amount of salt and water has to be equal to the amount of flour. So that means I have to divide everything by the same number. In order to do that, I need to figure out how much smaller 1/2 is than 2. I'm going to do this using a simple equation. So 1/2 is the same as 2 divided by what? 2 divided by 4 equals 1/2. Therefore, I know 4 is what I need to divide everything by in order to get the correct measurements. So here's what I'm going to do. X is how much salt I need. X is how much water I need. So second equation, X equals, I'm starting with 1 cup of salt. So I write 1 and I divide it by that 4 because I need to divide every single one by the same thing. So the same thing for water, 1 cup of water divided by 4. Everything is divided by 4. So now we need to figure out how much salt and how much water we need. 1 divided by 4 is 1/4 or 0.25. 1/4 times 4 equals 1. Just to go backwards and double check our math. So I know I need 1/4 cup of salt and 1/4 cup of water if I'm going to use half a cup of flour. This is my new recipe to make a smaller batch of clay. All right, in order to make our clay, we're gonna need a big bowl to mix everything in. Get your measuring cups ready and go ahead and measure out exactly how much flour, salt, and water you're gonna need so that you can add it to your bowl. Now, I don't actually have a measuring cup in a 1/4 increment, so I had to convert to tablespoons and measure that way. Now here's the trick real quick. If you do not measure liquids very often, never measure from above. Always look directly at your measuring cup when you are measuring liquids. That is going to ensure that you always get the correct measurement. If you look from above, that meniscus, the line where the top of the water is, isn't gonna be accurate. So now you see me mixing forever and ever. The mixing is gonna take a while. I got an extra tablespoon of flour and slowly added more because my dough felt too sticky. I don't think this messed up the recipe because I don't think I would have been able to work with it beforehand. And you saw how I measured my flour. I didn't do it that accurately. So it's probably my fault that the recipe was too sticky and that extra flour was needed. So now I'm going to make 2 different color batches, a blue batch and a green batch. And I'm doing this by just adding about 2 or 3 drops of food dye to my dough and then working it in. And I'm trying my best not to get it on my hands, but as you can see, it's getting all over my hands. Time to mix the blue. This is really my favorite part, is mixing the colors. All right, our colors are mixed. It is time to play with this clay and see what we can make. Now I'm gonna start out by using my super fancy book with some tin foil on it in order to work. And this is an easy way to make a working surface so you don't have to clean your table later. Alright, I decided I needed some tools. I have a chopstick, a butter knife, and a metal straw. Now, I decided to start out making a pretty large sculpture, something that would have a lot of body. But this clay is really struggling to hold its shape. It likes to form back into smooth lines. So the mouth that I carefully cut keeps closing. So we're adding some fins. Can you guess what I'm making? That's right, a fish. What else would I make? Now, just like I was mentioning before about how the mouth kept closing, everything squishes very easily. This clay, while it's fun to work with, might not be the best clay for making a big sculpture like this. And actually what I found when I was curing it, when I was cooking it, baking it to finish it and make it hard, is when it's that fat, it expands under heat and you actually lose a lot of your work. So I decided, you know what, I was really struggling to make that fish, so let's try making something flat. And I decided to go for an ornament, a heart-shaped ornament. Already, I can tell this is so much easier. This shape is so easy to roll out, so easy to cut, and when I take it up off the tin foil, it just smooths right out, and when I bake this later, it barely puffs up. I would definitely say do flat sculptures with the salt clay. Now this is my last experiment that I was doing. I was blending 2 colors together to make a swirly ornament. And of course, what am I gonna make for my swirly ornament? You guess. It's a fish. Now I actually rolled out this fish even thinner than the heart, and I think for the salt clay, the thinner you go, the better it'll bake afterwards. Smooth out the edges, and I'm going to go ahead and put everything on a oven rack and pop it in the toaster oven at about 275. Now you want to cook it for about 30 minutes for every 1/4 inch of clay. So that means that fish should be cooking for about an hour to an hour and a half. The ornaments only need about 15 minutes. Alrighty, time for silky dough. Now silky dough only has 2 ingredients, cornstarch and cheap hair conditioner. Now I have never made silky dough before, so I had no idea how this was gonna turn out. We're doing the same thing, making it into a smaller recipe by dividing by a common number. Alright, our recipe has been reduced. It is time to get our supplies and start mixing. Now you will notice that cornstarch was very poorly measured, and I will pay for that in this mixing process. Always measure carefully the first time. Learn from my mistake. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Now the silky dough, even when I felt like it had the right consistency, was still very messy. So here is our finished silky dough. Sticking to the bowl because it likes to be trouble and breaking apart instantly. At this point I had no idea what was going on. This is not what the recipe told me would happen. But it makes sense if you know even a little bit of science that this is what happened. Alright, getting out our fancy working book again, and we're going to attempt to make a fish. Now it took me about half a second to realize making a fish with silky dough is completely impossible. And that is due to the nature of this dough, of this clay. Silky dough has more in common with non-Newtonian fluid than it does with the salt dough, even though the recipe said it was a clay. When I exert enough force on the dough, it rips. Alright, we started this video with some math, now we're going to get into some science. This clay reminded me of non-Newtonian fluid, so I had to look it up and double check what the recipe for non-Newtonian fluid was and see if maybe I could turn my clay into non-Newtonian fluid. First off, non-Newtonian fluid is a fluid that does not follow Newton's law of viscosity. Viscosity is how thick or thin something is. Now, Newton's law of viscosity says that something is going to keep the same thickness or thinness no matter how much stress you put on it. In non-Newtonian fluids, that's not true because they get thicker if you put a lot of stress on them, and then they get thin if they're not under stress. Whew! I don't know about you, that's enough science for now. Let's look at our third and final clay, polymer clay. Polymer clay is a type of artist clay that dries into a hard plastic. You can cut it into really clean lines and mold it into whatever shape you want to. It comes in all sorts of colors and doesn't dry out. Now, what I want to show you is one of my favorite techniques you can do with this type of clay, which is called caning. Caning is where you make one really fat roll with a design in the center, and then you roll it into skinnier and skinnier little sausages that you can cut paper thin, and that design that's on the end of the cane goes all the way through, no matter how small you roll it. So all 3 of these canes that you see me cutting right now are derived from one big fat cane that I made first. That first one got messed up. Don't worry, it goes straight to the trash can. The second one looks great. Sometimes the design on the end gets messed up. And no matter how small you roll the cane, that design will always stay the same. Now, polymer clay is great because I can just stick these little pieces together and then pop them in the oven and they'll stay together forever now. Once they come out of the oven, they will be hard and retain that beautiful bright color that they had beforehand. Alright, 8th grade, now you have seen 3 different types of clay, how to make 2 at home, and 1 that is a professional artist clay and how it differs from the homemade clays. You need to go ahead and fill out your KWL chart, anything you know about clay at all, anything you wanted to learn, and anything you did.